Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commission. I'm just going to remind you that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed now. Please can you all keep your microphones on mute throughout the meeting. This will prevent audio feedback, which I'm currently experiencing. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand to get my attention. The chat function online must not be used to have conversations with other participants or to provide personal information. All chat is recorded as this is a formal meeting. This is a formal meeting of Hackney Council. Please note that the press may be in attendance. The rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting will apply. Okay, now it doesn't look as if we have anybody joining us online. And we've received apologies for absence from Councillor Adajari and from Councillor Sadek. Do we have any other apologies? No? Okay. Moving on to item 2. Are there any urgent items? No, nothing. I'm just going to take this opportunity to announce that the second item on our agenda tonight, which was Cabinet question time with Councillor Sem Moema, won't be going ahead. Councillor Moema has sent her apologies and that item will be rescheduled. Item number 3, declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. Okay, that brings me to item 4, which is going to be the sole focus tonight, temporary accommodation. Unaffordable and insecure housing, a lack of social homes, and changes to benefits and local housing allowance have led to a sharp increase in homelessness in London in recent years. This has led to an increase in demand for temporary accommodation across the capital. The Commission has requested this item as we are keen to hear about the current situation with regard to the provision of temporary accommodation in Hackney. As part of the scrutiny process, members undertook site visits to temporary accommodation hostels in Hackney and also reached out to residents to submit testimonies of their experiences of temporary accommodation in Hackney. The Commission will be assisted by contributions from the Mayoral Advisor for Homelessness and Housing Needs and officers from across housing needs and adult social care. So, attending for this item, can I please welcome Councillor Sade Etty, who's the Mayoral Advisor for Housing Needs and Homelessness. And we also have Rob Miller with us tonight, who's the Strategic Director of Customers and the Workplace. We have online. No, we don't have any other officers online yet. Hopefully they may join us during the meeting. We're also expecting Stephen Helder from the Resident Liaison Group. So hopefully they too will join us at some stage. Yeah. And yes, welcome to you, Beverly, from Adult Social Care. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to invite Councillor Etty and Rob to give us a presentation to supplement the written submission that we received in advance of the meeting. So please, if this could be kept to roughly 10 minutes, we would appreciate it. And we do really appreciate the evidence that you've already provided. Okay, over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Councillor Sade Etty, Mayoral Advisor for Homelessness, Housing Needs and Rough Sleeping. The topic of discussion for tonight is, first of all, let me apologies from Jennifer Winter and Claire. I mean, Jennifer won't be available and Claire is on leave at the moment. So apologies from both of them. They won't be joining us tonight, but we have Ian Williams joining us. So when we're talking about temporary accommodation, this falls within our homelessness strategy. And it also forms one of the key to our service that will respond to the needs of the resident through acknowledging their experiences and responding to their concerns and ask. In everything that we do within this service is geared toward preventing homelessness. We have a duty to provide temporary accommodation to homeless households the worsening housing crisis now means the demand far outstrips supply available. The Housing Authority can provide accommodation. We provide accommodation from within our own stock, or we arrange for it to be provided by another landlord. For example, a housing association or a landlord in the private rented sector. If settled accommodation is not immediately available, temporary accommodation must be made available until the applicant can find a settled home, or until some other circumstance brings the duty to an end. For example, where the household voluntarily leaves the temporary accommodation provided by the Housing Authority. The private sector has become increasingly unaffordable, and the social sector unable to cope with demand. The number of households in temporary accommodation in Hackney peaked during 2021 at the highest number in a decade, at more than 3,200 households living in temporary accommodation provided. We had over 1,200 outside the borough, placed outside the borough, and the number placed within the borough, we had over 2,000. So in everything that we are doing, we're still keeping the majority of our residents within their network, within the borough. And in line with our manifesto, which says we will expand council-owned or leased accommodation for homeless people, especially to meet the growing needs of single homeless people and families. We continue to see the increase in single homeless walking through our doors with multi-complex needs, and at the same time, with regards to single parents and children, and also families, we continue to see the same level in the last 5 years, and families is on the increase as we speak. But we will continue to do all within our capacity to have the majority of our residents within the borough and within their network. And we will continue to invest and develop our temporary accommodation provision. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about in terms of the tenure. For council-owned hostel, we had over 249 placed. For long list, which is housing association, we had 122, and within the council, we've made use of properties as regards to regeneration, pending the redevelopment. But at the same time, we are beginning to make use of short-term and bed and breakfast in terms of commercial hotel accommodation purchased at a nightly rate. And all this sincerely contributes to the increase in our expenditure when it comes to temporary accommodation. Let me go to what is driving the demand. With regards to driving the demand, nationally, statutory homelessness started to rise in 2010 and 11. But there's a lot of factors. Government policy failure. The government policy pledged to continue to increase the number of homes being built. It stated a need to rebalance the housing market towards more home ownership. Most fundamentally, the government has prioritized owner occupation over the supply of truly affordable council housing. Thereby, grant rates are low, which means that the building of new council homes is very difficult simply because they are not financially viable. And that is why whenever we build units, we have to build units for sale to cross-subsidize the supply of council housing. And hope is not lost because we continue to lobby the government to increase the grant rate. But mind you, the increase in terms of the receipt we can use from right to buy has been increased from 30 to 40%. But this is still nowhere near what we need to provide when it comes to council housing. And in general, the housing supply policy of the government moved towards home ownership. And you are all aware as well in terms of the application of benefit cap, LHA rates, This morning, I attended a meeting with Capital Letters. Capital Letters is an organization that is being funded by the government to get accommodation for all the boroughs to avoid boroughs when it comes in terms of competition. At the moment, as at this morning, Capital Letters are also struggling. We had representatives from London boroughs at the meeting. So what we're talking about is not only with regards to Hackney, it's something that, with regards to London-wide. So I'll hand over to Ian.
Thank you very much, Councillor Etty, and thank you, Chair. Hopefully, I'll go through just a few summaries quite quickly. I shan't read the report, but hopefully that information we've provided in there is useful. Before we start, there were just a couple of points for the record we just wanted to clarify. Beverly, shall I just highlight the update on the Hackney Engage floating support service, where I think the value in the report is incorrect. So it's 1.2 million annual value, and it's now designed to support 550 people. So it's a different quantum. It's about half what it says in the report. Also, it was really welcome to have the opportunity to take members to see some of our TA, both TA, which we are proud of in terms of where we have done the investments we want to make and achieved a standard that we think is a good standard for TA, but also TA where we've got work in progress to bring it to that standard, and TA where plans, hostelware plans are being developed to bring to that standard. And hopefully that gave members the opportunity to see that determination that we've got around quality. On the members' report of that, there were a couple of things just to pick up. There was a reference to dampness, which we didn't pick up ourselves from the conversations. So if we could pick that up afterwards, we'll make sure our health and safety surveyor validates if work's needed there. And there were a couple of references around the size of space and access to bathrooms and the like. I just wanted to confirm that we absolutely meet all of the legal requirements for TA provision. I think for many of us, the legal requirements are less than we would want, but we meet all of those, and we also aim to go beyond those. So, for example, shared and communal spaces are not part of the core legal requirement, but where we can, we do provide those. So, without wanting to repeat Councillor Etty's really eloquent description of fundamentally the crisis that sits around this, the bottom of page 1, we've highlighted 6 key areas, which I think hopefully give members a sense of what we're talking about here. So the first area, in terms of rise in demand, we're seeing increasing numbers of people who just can't afford the rental market in Hackney, and we all understand the impact of the LHA cap. We also know that policy over the last 30 years has led to a really significant reduction in social housing. We talked about that at the briefing session on Monday. Checking the figures, there's 9,372 socially rented homes which have been sold under right to buy in Hackney, of which 571 have been sold since 2015. So it's still a problem which is reducing our supply of social housing stock. And of those, 2,153 have been sold on by former tenants since 2020. So we're seeing a reducing supply of affordable rented homes. 2153 sold by former tenants since 2020. There's an article in the Hackney Gazette where the council spoke about that, and I'd happily share that with Craig afterwards. We're also seeing at the moment a growing and alarming trend of private landlords exiting the market. So, for example, the impacts of mortgage rates are having a big impact on private landlords. We're seeing fewer properties for rent, and we're seeing those go for more expensive rents. And we're seeing people being evicted as people are seeking to increase the rent because the market allows it. In the report, we've got figures there, but Hackney has the 4th highest rate of homelessness in London there. So it's a particularly acute challenge here, and we're a borough which is not very big in terms of the square miles, and therefore that presents a real challenge in terms of both affordable rented accommodation and also temporary accommodation. In terms of reducing supply of TA, we're also seeing private landlords exiting the market for TA provision. So I think at the time of writing this, we had 180 units where the landlords had written to tell us that they were taking them away. We've had a number of areas where, again, working with other members of Ian's teams around finance, we've worked really hard to try to secure long leases on TA, and we've had deals fall through at the last minute because effectively we've been gazumped. And we're seeing extreme competition. And one of the challenges that presents for the people we're trying to support is again, a thing we talked about Monday, they get very little time to make choices because someone else will snap the property up. And that puts people who are already in a challenging and vulnerable position under a huge amount of pressure, and we absolutely feel that. In terms of the quality, I talked earlier, but just to highlight in the report, there's 2.3 million of capital investment next year, targeting areas like fire risk mitigations. There's some lift repairs at Glevelands, and again, like we saw on the tour, significant investments in improving our TA accommodation. We don't want to accept an idea that because someone's in TA, then they don't have a right to a good quality place to live. We really aspire to, like we saw, the best of what we saw. The financial pressures are significant. I'd be remiss and in trouble next time I have a one-to-one with Ian if I didn't highlight that. But again, in the report, there's very, very significant growth in the spend, forecast to reach something in the region of 10 million for the current financial year, significant overspend in the context of cuts to the government, to the general fund, which are material. It's also very difficult for people to find settled accommodation. So TA is designed to provide that bridge for people who have become homeless, but actually it's in that wider market context of less social housing, less affordable housing, it's really challenging to support people who are moving on. And again, often, and again, when I look at casework, I see people are being presented with choices which are not what they want, and you can understand why. But again, when we look at the sizes of TA, when we look at the space available in TA, for example, these are not long-term homes for people. And that, I think, is, we're really keen to try and help people find solutions to find settled housing, but in the context of that really complicated market. Drawing to a conclusion, so Beverly will talk in more detail, but I also wanted to highlight the growing complexity of needs. So we're seeing more people in TA, more people in our TA hostels, where they will be getting some elements of health, mental health or social care support, but they're not reaching thresholds for kind of more specialist accommodation. It's increasingly challenging for us to provide the support those people need. We aren't just putting our hands up and saying there's nothing we can do about it. So we're doing a huge amount around that. Trauma-informed training for our staff. Work really closely with colleagues in adult social care, and we have 2 social workers embedded in the housing needs service, again, trying to break down those boundaries between the organisation, one of whom is a mental health social worker. Beverly can talk about the floating support contract. Again, that's there to support people, but we're also working really closely together with colleagues in adults and health integration to look at how we can redesign and recommission that to meet the needs of the people who are presenting to us. I met yesterday, Jennifer and I meet every couple of months with the hostel managers to spend time with them, hear about the challenges they're facing. Some of them are practical, some of them are actually really challenging, and hearing people talking about some of the mental health needs that they're supporting. These are people whose job has historically been about a caretaker role, but they're actually having to kind of fill a really complicated gap there. Proactive support around like Money Hub and the Link Work project we've done in customer services, those are homelessness prevention activities. So we've got a growing number of cases where we can show that the Money Hub, for example, is significantly helping people who are otherwise in financial difficulty. So we've paid out currently in the financial year 378,000 in crisis funds. Really important, by helping people access benefits they're entitled to but aren't currently claiming, we've been able to increase incomes by 287,000 per year through that work, and our goal is 1 million by November. So again, we've got activities like that where we're not just delivering a traditional service, we're redesigning the way we work to try and prevent homelessness. I join Jennifer and team at monthly multidisciplinary team meetings where we make sure that people aren't falling through the cracks between housing services, benefits and housing needs, health, mental health, social care. So we come together and we regularly look at people with extremely challenging situations. And it's, as somebody who's not a professional in that space, hearing those people focusing on what they can do and the people-centered focus on that is really inspiring. But also it's really humbling when you look at some of the complexities that people have to deal with in their lives and the challenges in accessing the support for that. We're also looking further. So again, like I said, working closely with colleagues in adults and health integration on housing related support and how we can redesign that. Also within the benefits and housing needs to try and make sure we're better positioned to respond to those complex needs, looking at how we can create a complex needs team to wrap around the hostels team. Excuse me, get to my note here. I think there's a number of things in the summary there which really just show, you know, it's not just residents speaking with you, it's not just yourselves or ourselves who think that TA is not the place where people need to be for the long term. I mean, I feel dreadful when I see cases of people with young families growing up through their school years and adulthood in kind of small spaces. And I think about that for my children, and it is really just really difficult. And I wish we could do more. And I'm really important to us that we're continuing to push ourselves. And then just to wrap up at the bottom, really, as Councillor Etty said, we're really committed to the quality of our TA. We're investing hard within the financial constraints. We're trying all manner of innovative approaches to try and bring more TA into supply. We've got conversations at the moment with other providers who may not have accommodation in Hackney, but would have accommodation much closer to the borough than, for example, Peterborough or Wellingborough, where we're currently having to send families well beyond their family connections in the borough. So I'd just like to kind of really welcome questions, but just to kind of finish on that note, it's a huge challenge. It's a massive crisis. As Councillor Etty said, all of London is suffering from this, and the UK more widely. We're not just taking it lying down, and really appreciate your support and determination to support the people affected by this.
Thank you very much, Rob. Oh, is it a point of order, Councillor Rathbone? Go ahead. Okay, we're not actually going straight into questions just yet. We've got some resident testimonies now. Okay, well, we're actually going to show some resident testimonies and then we're going to go into questions, so it won't be much longer. Thank you very much, Rob, and Councillor Etty for that, and we do appreciate all the work that your service is doing. We know that you're operating in almost impossible circumstances, so thank you very much for explaining some of the work that you're doing there. Yeah. I think we mentioned earlier that the Commission's reached out to local people to share some testimonies of their time in temporary accommodation so that we can better understand what it's like, how common certain issues are and how it impacts people. So we feel that listening to and allowing the voices of local people to be heard is really central to Scrutiny's effectiveness and the work that we do in this Commission. It allows us to hear directly from residents on issues that matter to them, gives them a clear stake in Scrutiny's work, and enables their concerns to drive service improvements going forward. The public cannot all be engaged in the same way. So some might feel comfortable with these type of formal meetings, others might find them quite alienating. So we therefore try to be as accommodating, as proactive, I suppose, as we can be in involving the public in our work. So the testimonies that you're going to hear now, we just want to clearly state that they represent a small sample of the experiences of those that have lived in temporary accommodation. They are not necessarily representative of the experiences of the majority. However, we do think it's important to explore the wider strategic themes and some of the issues that are highlighted and ascertain whether they speak to more common issues that may be familiar to members who deal with temporary accommodation routinely through their casework. So we've selected 2 resident testimonies to be shared. The first is a video clip, which will shortly be shown on the screen. It was submitted by a resident that we'll call Mr. E, and it highlights some of the issues with the move on from temporary accommodation and support for residents with complex needs. So please watch. Thank you. Hello, Tommy.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
No problem. We're just making a very short video, as you know. So you're living here. How long have you been living here for?
I've been in this building for about 2 years, 2 to 3 years now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is a private rented accommodation.
It is. First of all, they put me in a bed seat, where I couldn't turn around, but for some time, then they removed me to one cubicle under the staircase, and I mean, through the kitchen, which is not very healthy, and finally they brought me here, and this seemed to be. Can see how crowded it is with my medical treatment parcels.
Yeah, it's not
very
a very large room. Yeah, And you were previously in that room that
Yeah,
was next to the kitchen,
next to the
but
kitchen.
we complained
Yeah,
about that and then
yeah,
they condemned that room, didn't they?
That's true.
So this was previously a 2-bedroom flat that they've divided into.
Yes, yes. This is. Can you hear this?
Mhm.
That's the sound of plywood or something.
And how many
Mm.
people are living here now?
Now we have 4 people living here.
Okay. And you share the kitchen.
We share the kitchen, we
Mhm.
share the toilets
Mm-hmm.
and the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Only one of them.
And how did you come to be living here? I understand that you were in temporary accommodation.
Yeah, I was first of all taken by the council to hostel.
Mm-hmm.
This Eric something hostel in
Was it Eric House?
Green,
Maybe.
Green Lane.
Yeah.
Yeah, and from there they asked me that I must go private. So I started with city room.
That's the landlord here.
The landlord, yeah.
And how old are you, Tommy?
Yeah,
If you don't mind me asking that.
I'm advancing to 81.
Did you get any advice about sheltered accommodation or those kind of things when?
Apart from my interaction with the council, where they said that I had some saving above
Mm-hmm.
the
Above the
level,
threshold, yeah.
and then on that basis, they tossed me out, and I've already also applied to sanctuary housing.
Mm-hmm.
I've applied to Hounds housing,
Mm-hmm.
and they said I
Mm-hmm.
have not gotten a good result up to now.
Hopefully, we'll get some advice on that. And tell me, just before we finish, what was it like in the hostel? How did you find living in the hostel in Eric House?
Oh, that hostel was a den of a small hole. We have the single, what do you call it, single bed.
Mm-hmm.
When you lie there, you cannot turn. You have to wake up again before you can turn, and otherwise you will fall on the ground. But it has self-contained kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
but bathroom and toilet.
So you had
Yeah.
your own You had your own kitchen.
The kitchen was just in that very small.
In the room. In the room.
Yes,
Okay.
in the room.
Okay. Thank you very much for
So,
sharing this.
thank you for coming.
Take
Thank
care.
you very much.
Thank you all. So for the second testimony, resident P, she wanted to remain anonymous. And I think in terms of summarising the issues, I'm going to read it out in a second, but there's an acceptance that she's in temporary accommodation. We don't have very much social housing, and I think that's something that we all acknowledge. But the issues she identifies are around the privacy aspects in temporary accommodation, as well as communication between the council and the resident that's in temporary accommodation. So I hope you've all managed to read it, but I'll read it out quite briefly. It's not very long. Resident P says, I was in temporary accommodation between 2017 to 2020 when I moved into my council home. The main issue was with the settled homes team, who kept contacting me with no appointment or anything. It felt like harassment. They kept telling me that I needed to look at private rented accommodation or be discharged, but I wanted to wait for social. I had it in writing that I should be offered social. I was bidding and I was viewing social and coming second or third sometimes. That's both housing associations and council. I spent 3 years in temporary accommodation with my child, and the worst was these appointments that they would give me at very short notice, meaning I got into a lot of problems at work. I had to attend, or it's intentionally homeless. I had it in writing that they wouldn't be offering any more private sector homes. I could have got one of those for myself in the first place, but I spent 3 years in a room with a child in temporary accommodation. The issue with the private sector is they raise the rent, you get evicted, problems occur very easy. I have serious health issues too. However, they were still sending me letters to view private, outside of London, far away from work and my child's nursery. Sometimes offering me a group viewing, and then sometimes a letter saying it was a direct offer. I found it very confusing. Often I got home from work to find an invitation to a viewing that had happened that same day. When I told them I needed to give advance notice to my boss at work, they would say I need to leave work regardless, and these are market forces we are operating under. No one seemed to care. Could they leave work just like that? When I was in the hostel, the manager, well, he would come into my room anytime he wanted, which was very often. Always some reason, like he wants to change the light, even though it's not broken. I asked him if he could wait until I come home from work and we can look at anything that needs looking at together at an agreed time. But he never did that and just came in if I was there or not. I didn't feel safe there. My child didn't. There was no privacy whatsoever, and I was paying quite a lot of money to be there. I just felt awful. I was on tablets and I felt like I had no control over my life in there, and quite unsafe that this man could come into my room whenever he wants and no one seems to care. You couldn't have any visitors, not even to help with looking after my child. It was lonely, a nightmare I would call it. We had to share a single bed and there was leaks and always a strong smell of tobacco. We kept all our stuff in bin bags. I was successful in bidding for a council home, even though they kept telling me I had no realistic prospects. Okay, so those are the testimonies that we've heard, and I think that's quite enough from me for now. So I'd like to thank everybody for their patience, and I'm now going to invite you all to ask some questions to put them to our guests. Okay, members of the Commission. So we have Councillor Rathbone. I don't know how our guests would prefer it. Would you like to hear 3 questions at a time, or would you just like to take one at a time? What would be best for you?
Should we try 3 at a time, and then if we're struggling, then maybe we could change that?
Okay, let's try. So I think we've got Councillor Rathbone first. Yeah. Councillor Palace there has just made the point that members may want to do follow-ups, and that can get a little bit disjointed if we do in 3s. So I do beg your pardon. Should we stick with 1 at a time? That sounds good. In that case, over to you, Councillor Rathbone.
Thank you very much, Chair. You may not be able to answer this question because you're not comms people quite, but I just wondered how communication is done with people who are in TA, because certainly people I deal with casework, they really don't know what's going on. And in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we as councillors have received a lot of information which is quite staggering, but very helpful in understanding that situation. And I'm wondering whether that kind of information should be put over to people in temporary accommodation so they know the reality of what is actually happening. So that's one strand of communication which I'm interested in, whether it's, as it were, a newsletter or text on their phones or whatever it is. And then secondly, the same information, the reality of that situation that we face with housing needs in particular, going out to the public. Is there a plan to actually let the public know exactly what is going on? Because I mean, apart from all else, they should know anyway, but it really does help us as councillors, because I spend a lot of time actually talking to people and they find it really difficult. 19 years for a 2-bed flat? Surely not. That can't be right. We need to kind of like get people to realise that, you know, this is the reality that we actually face.
So in terms of the general wider communications, the challenges around the housing situation is without doubt something which the council has continued to focus on communicating. So, for example, that huge number of right to buy homes which have then been sold on was a council press release. We do a lot of work in terms of sharing, for example, the work we've done around hostel upgrades, bringing former right to buy homes back into stock through buyback. So there's a lot of comms around that, but I think the reality of an individual situation means that things on the council website aren't, you know, that's not what's going to really help them understand where they are. So one of the things we have is when someone approaches us and presents as homeless, then our housing officers will work with them and create a personal housing plan that will go through their situation. It'll talk about things like their savings, their income, help them understand what's affordable on the market. We also we provide information about the waiting time, because the waiting time varies depending on how many rooms people need. One of the sad realities is that often people who have a smaller number of rooms that they need don't get to the front of the list for that before maybe another child arrives, and then they move into a different size of need. So we do whatever we can to try to help people access social housing, but we have about 450 lets a year with a waiting list of 8,500, and people don't get on the register unless they've got significant overcrowding of 2 or more rooms, or they've got significant medical need. So often the communication is all about what is available and affordable in the private rented sector. But again, one of the things I said earlier, the pace at which that changes makes it really hard for people. So we were talking the other day about cases where we had an opportunity, it wasn't in borough, so therefore that person didn't prefer it, but actually what they need would be extremely hard to find in borough. But it had been snapped up by the time we'd really been able to work through that conversation. So the PHP, the personal housing plan, is really important in terms of setting that expectation. But as we've seen in some of the testimonies, it sounds to people like we're hectoring them sometimes, but that's because the reality of the situation is what it is.
Just to follow up, I can appreciate it's just that our policy is to communicate with our tenants and leaseholders on estates, and we have a glossy publication that comes out every so often that does that. I'm actually saying, is there something that goes out similar? Are we actually following through with people in temporary accommodation as well, so that it's not just about telling them what's available, it's actually keeping them in touch, helping them to feel that they belong to the community of Hackney residents, because they may be somewhere else, but at least they're finding out. I mean, this is a PR function, but I mean, that's what goes on with the newsletter to tenants, isn't it?
Can I, yes, thank you, Councillor Radburn. With regards to communication, and based on what, I'm just going to follow up with what Rob has said, in terms of personal housing plan, and our residents to know, to make a choice with regards to that when they're in temporary accommodation. And with regards to the wider public, we have something that we call Homelessness Partnership Board. The Homelessness Partnership Board consists of majority of our charities within the borough. We work with them and also our various stakeholders. We have a wider meeting, we have a core group, and we also have the general wider group, where we have this conversation from time to time, and for them to also talk to those to residents and who are using their services, so that we'll be able to get the information out as much as possible. And within the temporary accommodation, the manager ensure that the information from time to time, they support the residents with regards based on the personal housing plan. We really have to stress that, because the personal housing plan takes into consideration the affordability, the employment, the size, and also the options when we're looking at housing options that the resident is looking into. So we really have to take that into consideration, and the hostel managers use this to support residents accordingly. And where we have the personal housing plan, where there are other multi-services involved, I mean, that is where the joint work also comes in. Maybe we're talking about the social services or mental health, because we have to bear in mind that we have some residents that are not meant to be in general needs temporary accommodation that are there. And it's all because we do not have the supported accommodation that is being required. We do not have the resources and the funding for that. But what I can say is we've had various ways of working in this last 1 or 2 years. We've looked at several things within the service, and a lot of changes is being made. So regards to communication, yes, it is. Managers are working with residents from time to time They air their opinion. Residents air their complaints where there's complaint. In terms of housing benefits, if anyone has issues with housing benefits, they are there to support them. You have the hub that we have at the moment. Whatever it is, they have their managers, and that's why we always, when there are casework, the first question we ask is, have you reported this to the manager? Because that is their role. That is why they are there to support the resident, and at the same time, not to take everything on board, but also to reach out to those that are supporting the residents, depending on various needs and their needs assessment, and also it also depends on the risk assessment of some of these residents as well. So it is not a one-stop, it depends on individual needs and risk.
Thank you. Councillor Garbutt.
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow up on this theme around kind of resident voice and inclusion, because you described a couple of things there, and it'd be really interesting to understand what from those are kind of the more formal mechanisms of kind of resident and tenant feedback, and if they're provided with any kind of resources to form kind of tenant groups like space to meet and things like that, and if there's any role for, or if the resident participation team, like they come under the kind of banner of getting some support from them as well.
I think the key thing here is that the people in TA aren't tenants, so they aren't intended to be homes which people stay in for an extended period of time, and often we will need to move people within our TA estate because of different needs, or we'll find that people who have kind of more complex needs we need to home. So we don't have that kind of settled community in the same way that you would expect, for example, in our estates and our tenant groups there.
Rob, if I can just pick up on that point, if you don't mind, about the moves in between temporary accommodation. The shelter report into temporary accommodation identified frequent moves as being, quite a source of distress for people, with 2/3 of people only given about 48 hours notice. Could you describe the process of moving and why somebody would be moved from one temporary accommodation to another? Thank you.
There could be all manner of reasons. So as I said earlier, we've had 180 units where the landlords have told us that they won't be able to continue to provide them to us. So we will have to.
Rob, I'm really sorry. I can't quite catch what you're saying. I don't know if
sorry.
it's the mic. Would you just speak a little bit more? Sorry, it might be because I'm sitting further back.
Suffering from a bit of a sore throat today. So as one example, the 180 notices to quit we've received mean that we will have to find alternative accommodation for people. Sometimes our what we can secure is short term, so it's not the same as a settled housing stock that, for example, our colleagues in housing services and tenancy management would manage. There could be any manner of other reasons where we need to move people around. So we would try. We wouldn't be seeking to do that, but there would be occasions where we would need to. And again, it's that temporary nature of TA. It isn't a long-term home for people, and the emphasis really is on helping them find alternative settled accommodation.
Councillor Bree.
Thank you. I guess the point I want to pick up on really is the fact that although this is called temporary accommodation, we've been hearing that for a lot of people it isn't temporary accommodation. And particularly if we think in terms of children, perhaps spending their entire childhood actually in temporary accommodation, those are their homes. And it seems to me that given that that's the reality of the situation, we have to start to look at ways in which we can offer those residents who are long-term in temporary accommodation with some of the rights and benefits, if you like, that social benefits that some of our tenants have. Because it's not fair on the long-term residents, in particular, I think children, if they're not having those things. So just to give you a few examples, I mean, clearly the biggest deprivation of temporary housing is space, because it is inevitably overcrowded. But in most of our temporary accommodation, perhaps all of it, I don't think any visitors are allowed. And whilst I'm not suggesting that it would be appropriate to have visitors coming in and out all the time, what that means for a parent with young children is that they can never have a babysitter. That's a huge social impact on people. So I just feel that it would be useful for us, given that we're in this crisis and that people are in temporary accommodation for a long period at times, to have a look at some of those rules which were designed for a different era and look at what we can do to try to improve things for people who are there long term.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rout. I'm sure you saw the report by Shelter, and I think everyone is really concerned with that, with regards to the report, where we see so many children. I think in Hackney, we have about 3,000 children in temporary accommodation as we speak. And we have to start looking at the quality of life when we're and health and well-being when it comes to the children as well. And one of the things, I mean, let me start an example in one of our hostels where we have Carries. Carries. It's a charity that works with children, and they attend one of our hostels. I mean, in terms of homework and all that activities, and we also have housing the play bus as well. So we are trying to put all this into place, but the temporary accommodation, unfortunately, is becoming a long-term accommodation. And why is that? It is not, we all have to look into this deeply. We have to do what we can when it comes to the children. And one of the things we're looking at is when you see the standard, we all went over, you went for the visit. We're trying to ensure a better standard compared to where our temporary accommodation was years ago. And with the current standard, it's still not where it should be, because temporary accommodation is not a suitable home. It is still temporary. And I think the onus is for us now to continue to have the conversation with families when we're looking at options. What are those options that are available? What are those options? Do we want children to continue to live in temporary accommodation for 14, 15 years? Or will parents be willing to have that conversation to look at housing options that are available? We're looking at mutual exchange. We're looking at various options. But at the same time, we have to be mindful when we look at affordability with regards to majority of our residents. They're working. It's not as if they're not working. They're working, but unfortunately, they're on low income and they are unable. So how do we meet up with this? So I think it's a very critical area that we have to look into. But I think what we have to do is to continue to work with residents in terms of looking at those options, housing options, in order for families. And unfortunately, we don't have the answer within Hackney.
I do have a follow-up. It's probably that I wasn't explaining myself as clearly as I probably should have done. I suppose what I was trying to say was that some of the rules which are imposed on the hostels seem to me that they're imposed on the hostels for a different period. And I would like to see a bit of a revision of some of those rules, because I think that they make some of the living circumstances for those individuals and families quite inhumane. It's, they're the kind of rules that you could put up with living with for, 2 or 3 months, but if that becomes 2 or 3 years, that starts to have significant social impact. So I'd just like to hear a bit more about that. And I suppose if I can just add a little bit more onto that thought, I wonder if we also need to think about staffing levels in some of our hostels, because some of that may also require a little bit more staff to be able to facilitate some loosening of some of those rules as well. So thoughts about that?
Let me just come back on in terms of visitors policy. Yes, I quite agree. It's been on for a while, but when we have to look at the vulnerability of some of our residents in temporary accommodation, we have to be mindful of that. Take an example of Ivy House, where we have 94 or 92. How would we be able to ensure to know or to know who is in there? Number one, when you look at the vulnerability of our residents, somebody fleeing domestic violence, you have people with mental health. I mean, we're still talking about trauma-informed approach, and mental health is a key problem. No doubt about that. So these are some of the things we really need to consider. And considering what happened with the Grenfell, and the safety recommendations that came out of it, having that visitors policy is not only a policy at the moment, it's more or less becoming like a recommendation for us to sincerely look into and key into in order to prevent or to make sure to look after majority of our vulnerable people within the hostel. I mean, but one thing is there is flexibility. Where there is any resident that needs where there's a genuine need, all they have to do is to discuss with the manager, and the manager uses his or her discretion and work with the residents with the flexibility. So if we have residents that needs to have social worker or that needs other services, yes, no doubt about that. But in all cases, it's individually assessed and the resident needs to really have that conversation with the hostel manager. But I'm not saying we can't look into it. Definitely. I'm not saying it's not something that we can look into, but we just have to be mindful in terms of the vulnerability of our residents.
Thank you. I absolutely get the point you're making, Councillor Rao. I think the key challenge, though, is temporary accommodation is not settled housing, and the problem is a lack of settled housing. So we can't turn temporary accommodation into settled housing, because then we have nowhere to put people who are presenting as homeless, which is why we're sending people to Wellingborough and Peterborough, because we have nowhere to place them. So the rules around TA and the way in which the service is designed and modelled, we operate within, well, Ian might disagree that we operate within budget constraints because we spend well more than is anywhere near budgeted on TA, but there is no money to provide additional staffing. But what we can't do is turn it into a parallel social housing estate to make up for the shortfall caused by right to buy, the difficulty with providing, building new properties for social etc., because otherwise we're letting down the people presenting as homeless. And right now, it makes my heart bleed when I see cases where we're sending people so very far away from their support networks. We've looked at a case where a family are now having, in some ways they're fortunate because the home they found is within commuting distance of Hackney. But again, we were talking the other day about the huge challenges of bringing their children into the borough for school because they want to stay placed in the school. So it's really important that the TA estate is there for people presenting as homeless, so we can provide that emergency home housing and help them find other options. Looking at the first testimony, the really tough reality is there's a choice. There's a choice of an extended stay in TA where it is not designed as a settled home. In that case, that person has found a social let, and that's tremendous news, but it took 3 years. Or looking at other options, and in some cases those options are outside of London. And I've seen feedback from residents who have found secure rented housing outside of London, and actually in many cases you read that feedback and you see the difference it's made because they've now got outdoor space, their children are settled at schools.
Sorry, Rob,
So
I think we're going a long way from Councillor Root's original question. I do
Okay.
appreciate your comments, but I just want to make sure we get through. I mean, just to bring it back to the visitors, that was something that we really felt. We appreciate as a commission, absolutely, as all councillors do, the lack of social housing. What we really want to focus on, I think, is what is within our remit and small tweaks we could make just to make people's lives a little bit happier where they do find themselves. Okay, one more follow-up, Councillor Root, and then I'm going to have Councillor Young and Councillor.
It is very quick, really, which is that it seems to me that at the moment, all of our temporary accommodation has essentially the same rules, although the intake to different buildings can be quite different. And I wonder, therefore, if we could have some scope for reviewing some of those rules for example, what are we talking about with visitors in a hostel which is designed for single men who've just come out of prison? the visitor policy is going to be massively different to somewhere which is designed for families, et cetera, et cetera. And I would like to see a bit more flexibility, I suppose, in some of those social policies across our estate, rather than just having blanket rules about visitors. Can I also just say, by the by, that I have had quite a lot of casework where I've had to raise it as casework to enable people to have babysitters and what have you. So when you talk about it being at the discretion of the hostel managers, I think maybe they need a little bit more training about what is appropriate discretion. Finished. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. But I mean, maybe something to consider is like letting people sign in within certain hours and taking people's ID. Think just, I suppose the way you'd practice security in any other institution might work. Giving people the benefit of the doubt, I suppose. Anyway, forgive me for coming in there, Councillor Young.
Thank you to all of you who are here. I'm also very grateful to Jennifer Winter and Claire and her team for the visits, and I think the visits were incredibly informative to us. Quite a few of the places that we went to were in the ward that I represent, and have seen and see a lot of casework from those. Also just wanted to add that we have quite a substantial amount of temporary accommodation, not in temporary accommodation settings, but just in ordinary flats across the borough. And I'm aware that quite a substantial amount of that is in the Woodbury Down Old Estate, which of course is a significant regen site. That's mentioned in the report, and Rob Miller mentioned it just now. I want to ask a question about that particularly. So where we have temporary accommodation in regeneration sites, and therefore we know we're going to ultimately lose it, I've been reading the plan on our kind of strategic approach to temporary accommodation. What are we doing to replace that, firstly? But also, what are we doing for those people who we place in temporary accommodation on these regeneration sites in what are former right to buy homes, which are now privately owned, where we encourage people, or encourage in quite a strong way, to take privately rented accommodation, which means that we have then satisfied our statutory obligation to place them in what we call a settled home, even though we know it isn't. And what we do then, when we know that they will be evicted on decant and won't be considered to be in temporary accommodation, therefore won't be decanted. So it's really long-winded, but I know you're aware of the situation, and I'm concerned that I think we're going to lose about 400 temporary accommodation homes on Woodbury Down Estate as a whole. That's a big chunk of our TA. So what are we doing about those people who are in what's technically private, not temporary?
So to begin with, obviously with those homes there where they're in later phases and they're not immediately going to be decanted, that is one way that we can meet the urgent need around TA. So if we weren't using those, then Wellingborough would seem close. So using those is a pragmatic and sensible step. In terms of what we're doing about that, it would be easy to say we will have to face that problem when it arrives. Just because right now we can't find TA in the borough, even with those units being used to house people. What we're actually doing is a wide range of different things. So we've worked in partnership with providers. We've brought in investment to improve the standard of accommodation, like when we went to Cape House. That's now, when that work is completed, will be exclusively used by Hackney Council for TA, not by a mix of Hackney and other boroughs or private renters. So we're doing that kind of arrangement. We worked with local space, looking at move-on accommodation. We're in conversations with other potential partners. Sometimes, those are outside of the borough. There's a whole range of different things we're doing. But again, even the other day, we were very, very close to completing a deal to secure one of the properties we saw, and it fell through because the landlord took it off the market. So the reality of the situation is we're doing many, many different things, but I'm really sorry I can't give you an answer that gives any assurance around those 400.
So thank you. Just on those people who are put into private rented sector accommodation in ordinary flats. So in a sense, it's much better accommodation than the temporary accommodation hostels that we saw. Those people are then not in temporary accommodation according to our records, because statutorily we have discharged our obligation. Yeah. But we do know that they are in temporary accommodation. Now, some of those people are in later phases and therefore they'll be able to stay there for a bit longer. Some of them are in phases which are being decanted right now today. So our response then to those residents is, you're just, you're in private rented sector accommodation. Not, actually, we put you here, but we didn't call it temporary accommodation, we called it private rented sector. So I suppose my question is, could we be a bit more honest about what we're placing people in private rented sector housing when we know it's actually only temporary?
Thank you very much, Councillor Young. With regards to Woodbury Down, you can see it's in phases. And I think the next one is coming up in December. And I think we have a large, like you rightly said, if I could remember, let me just set an example of Tower Court, the people that moved out of Tower Court. We will always be realistic in terms of where and what is available. And because of the regeneration, the conversation will always be there for those that will be willing to come back. And for those, and in most cases, some will come back and take a new, in terms of the new accommodation, new property. Some might just decide, from evidence that we saw in Tower Court, some residents decided they were okay with where they are and they were not coming back into the borough, and some actually came back because they will always be on the priority. Definitely. So as of today, I think that's what we are saying when we're talking about temporary accommodation. And what we are doing is we're beginning to look at things differently from the council, because it can't be the same any longer. We have to continue to be proactive. And some of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to look towards other methods of increasing the supply of housing. And some of the things we're looking at is, how do we review the current financial incentive and current rates paid to landlords and agents? That's one of the things. And secondly, we're looking at to buy, we're looking at building, we're looking at modular homes. There are some spaces within the borough that has been highlighted for that, and conversation is still going on with housing strategy. So I want to think, by the time it gets to that, just because it's in phases, the rest assured that we will work with the resident accordingly. We will be clear and be plain and simple as always to manage people's expectation. We will not tell them what we cannot achieve, and definitely it's a matter of choice. We will need to have that two-way communication when it comes to December, by the time we get to that phase. But these are some of the ways of the things we want to do differently moving on with regards to temporary accommodation.
Thank you. Can I ask one more broad question on the same point? Thank you, that's really helpful. And I'm grateful that we've got in here as well, on the finance side. I was just wondering about it's really good to hear that we are looking at a wide range of options for temporary accommodation, as well as, of course, the answer is build more housing, acquire more housing. But what other kind of imaginative options are we looking for in terms of using meanwhile sites, capital letters? I understand capital letters is struggling at the moment. There are lots of things which I know a few years ago looked like the great hope for temporary accommodation, many of which have not come to fruition. Are there other things we could be looking at on the, financially, to reduce our cost on that very expensive temporary accommodation type of, places like Ivy House, to use those sites which, might be developed in future but aren't currently, for very clearly temporary accommodation, rather than while we wait for the long-term housing to be built. It feels like there must be scope to do more than we're doing because it's so desperate.
Yeah, so if I step in first and then hand over to Ian. So you're right. So one of the things we mentioned in the paper is the TA delivery group that we set up because we're actively looking for those sites. So for example, I think on Monday we talked about there are some sites where the nature of the site, potentially cross-rail tunnels underneath, don't lend themselves for social housing development, but could lend themselves to modular development. We also find that there are some areas, sorry, I should be nearer the mic, some areas where we really need help, I think, from our elected members in terms of making sure that our colleagues in the housing strategy teams who are helping identify those sites are kind of supported to make sure we're targeting sites where the local support will be there for things like modular, because we will find projects seem promising but don't come to fruition because there are complicated hyperlocal issues which need to be managed. So again, understanding the housing strategy work that's taking place at the moment, I think is a really good vehicle for that, and engaging with that process and members helping us make sure that we're sort of bringing those sites through. We have our asset review strategy, but also that process. But if there's other ways through that housing strategy work, we can get your insight and ideas as well. That'd be really helpful. Certainly from our perspective, if we were able to place 200 modular units for family accommodation on a vacant site, we would be absolutely delighted, because to give you an example, one of the cases where we were sending someone a very long way away from London, ideas last year about, well, we might be able to put family modular, didn't come to anything. That's a direct correlation of that person who's now well outside of the borough, and that's really upsetting.
Thanks for that, Rob, and absolutely really happy to answer that question. And I suppose I reflect on the fact that since 2010, when the housing needs team, which do a fantastic job of being part of Finance and Resources, I've been really proud about how they've worked, not just as a team but also with other colleagues across the council in extremely challenging circumstances. I think one of the things that I was really keen to say tonight, and why I was really keen to come along here, is we all recognise, not just within Hackney but across London, the scale of the challenge that's being faced. So I think all boroughs that I speak to are really experiencing real pressures and challenges in temporary accommodation. And that's why with colleagues on the Society of London Treasurers, we've formed a joint housing finance group with housing directors to see not only how we can tackle the challenges with TA, but also how we can work collegiately to see how we can bring forwards and speed up the necessary need in increasing supply, not just of temporary accommodation, but of genuinely affordable social housing. And I'm very clear in Hackney that is council housing. Obviously, we're all familiar on this commission doesn't need to know that the challenges that are currently in play with what's happening in the wider economy. But this is absolutely something that's front and centre. And only last week, seems a lifetime ago, we invited in a series of officials from DLUC, who are responsible for homelessness in particular, to set out the scale of the challenge that people across London are facing in terms of the actual really significant individual cases, but the financial pressure that's bringing on to boroughs. I'm aware of some neighbouring outer London boroughs that, even after agreeing their budgets, similar sorts of times to what we all sat in this room and agreed the budget here, are now anticipating potentially additional costs that they hadn't expected for the future financial year of over £10 million. That's not the case in Hackney because of how we do our budgets. We've been anticipating cost pressures and the like, but the scale of the challenge, I think, now is formidable. Rob and the team, Councillor Ette, supported by Councillor Chapman, have brought forward some really innovative approaches to expanding our supply of temporary accommodation. I think the real fundamental change in the sort of ecosystem we've been operating within has been the emergence of the Home Office as effectively a competitor that we just can't compete with in terms of the prices that they are prepared to pay to deal with the issues they've got, and they're all well documented, aren't they, in the press? And I think, and Rob alluded to earlier, a deal, for want of a better word, that we were very close to making, that was not an insignificant investment by the council, but we weren't just gazumped, we were whatever gazumped squared, or to the power 3 is. So I think that's of it. But we won't stop in terms of looking at innovative approaches to it. You all familiar on this Commission, I'm sure, with how we utilise flexibilities to bring forward the proposals to bring in those 2 GP surgeries and bringing buildings back into use, and obviously providing 2 fantastic facilities for our residents, really enhancing the offer there, but also doing it in a way that is affordable to the council and to taxpayers. But we aren't stopping there. We're also exploring options. I'm sorry, in terms of any flexibilities, and I'm not going to say there are easy choices that the pension committee might be able to take, but because obviously they have to meet the returns and the requirements there. But there are options around the local infrastructure investment element of our strategic asset allocation, which with Councillor Adams, Councillor Chapman, and members of the pension committee in this room, I think, are actively looking at in terms of what we can do to see whether, as long as the assets and the liabilities issue works itself through, there might be options that we can look at. But it is a really challenging position, but we are sort of straining every sinew to provide those proactive solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it urgent, Rob? Because I know
Yeah.
members are waiting with questions. So
But
if it's very brief.
It's just that I wasn't aware that the next item wasn't happening. So I'd assumed that our item would finish at 8. So I have to leave by 8:20.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
really
we
sorry.
were.
Yeah.
The next item isn't happening. Obviously, there's quite a lot of interest in this. So we did think maybe there was a little bit of flexibility on the timing.
I'm
Not-
really
not
sorry.
from
I've
your
made
end.
arrangements that I can't change.
Could you squeeze in a couple more?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We'll try and be as brief as possible. Councillor Ogundemurin, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your report you've given so far on the work that you and council officers are doing. My question is there any sort of proactive work we are doing or sort of feasibility studies in approaching businesses that have office space to use office space as temporary accommodation? Because following the pandemic, there is a vast decline in office space, and where Hackney is situated, we've got loads of offices that are stone throw away from the borough. So kind of seeing how we can create some sort of partnerships with these organizations to use these places as temporary accommodation.
Can I just answer that quickly? As at this morning when I attended Capital Letters, they have provided evidence to the Parliament based on that, so that for the possibility of conversion, in terms of conversion. So the evidence is still going on, and then by the time the report is finalized, then we'll be able to know where we are, because you'll be rest assured some of these are education building, and all the departments need to work together with regards to such conversion. But definitely, as we speak, it's not only going on within the council, it's also going on at the Parliament level.
I've got a couple, but
So is there a way we can feed into this work as councillors? Who would be the appropriate?
I will feed back to councillors once the report is finalized, but like I said, evidences are still being collated at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councillor Palace.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very, very difficult situation, and very much appreciate everything you're doing. Yeah, 2 kind of lines of inquiries. One, about the Haredi community. As you know, often very large families. Also, it's very difficult for them to move out of the kind of Hackney area. There's obviously been a bit of a move to Canby Island, but a lot of them are now coming back. There is Gateshead, there's a limited area where they can go to. How are we kind of meeting their needs in our current strategy?
You're right. So actually one of the things which the team flagged to me this week was actually some particular cases where we're in an extremely difficult situation because of some of the people who've approached us from the Haredi community and the size of their families. We're also actually really worried about the implications of some of the potential changes around the benefit system and larger families. So it's an area which is kind of great concern to us, and we're looking at how we can make sure we're sort of understanding those benefit changes as well, because that could create some quite significant additional difficulties for people in that community.
Yeah, so one of the community groups could have good as Israel, you must know, a housing association, one of the things that they're quite interested in is potentially voided properties within the Hackney housing stock, which are street properties, and whether there's any work being done to look at street properties which may be voided and exploring potential avenues around that. Is there any work being done around our current kind of stock, particularly around street properties that are voided, to look at potential opportunities to accommodate larger families?
Let me quickly come on in addition to what Robert said. We have just, within the team, we've just had, we're going to have additional officer with regards to look into that in terms of empty spaces within accommodation properties within the borough. And we're working in conjunction with housing strategy when it comes to that. And in terms of larger families, it's difficult because within our stock, we're only able to, it's about 3% within our stock. And that was one of the reasons why I said we have to look at doing things differently. Previously, we're buying back council accommodation. We're looking into buying housing association stock in future. We're looking, these are some of the things that we intend, some of the changes that we'll be bringing on with regards to our temporary accommodation strategy, and that's to look at things differently. So it's a very difficult one when it comes to larger families and within the borough. But at the same time, I think we should maximize whatever space we have, and we will continue to consider the larger families, but we have the percentage of the single homeless far exceeds in terms of the larger families. Unfortunately, no matter how much accommodation that we have within the larger families, it will not be able to go around everyone. So we have to be realistic about that, but we will not stop because we will continue to ensure that there are no communities left out in the borough.
Can I just ask a quick, just because we haven't mentioned it yet about properties outside of borough. So there's 1,200, I believe, that are outside of borough. I was just wondering whether you have a kind of idea in terms of disrepair issues, kind of what the numbers are in terms of disrepair issues raised on the stock within borough, and what the disrepair kind of tickets are like outside of borough.
With regards to within the borough, at the moment we have 16 million for the next 5 years to bring our properties into normal standard, into decent standard. So we have that with regards to within the borough, and also with regards to outside the borough, we have we are a member. We have a Pan London that we are a member, and also our officers check in terms of health and safety check, in terms of those properties, before we put people into temporary accommodation. They try their best to do as much check as they can. And where it is not suitable, definitely they will look for other places to move residents, as long as it's not suitable. But if we're looking at suitability, suitability is not only about size, but it's about livable. If the property is not livable, if there's so much damp or things like that, definitely they will find another property for the. So we have a team that are definitely working within that. We have a team within the temporary accommodation that are in charge of that.
Can I come in now, if I may, if anyone? Do you want to go ahead? Okay, I'll come after you.
Do you have any figures that the other boroughs, do they have any temporary accommodation units?
Councillor Osden, can you just direct the microphone? Yeah.
I said about the other boroughs, do they have any temporary accommodation units in Hackney? If they have, how many of them? Thank you.
We have boroughs that actually have properties within Hackney. There are boroughs that have purchased properties within the borough, within Hackney, to use for their residents. And that's what some of the problems that we're having. We just lost a very good one, like Ian was saying 2 weeks ago, because the landlord or the owner of the property decided to give it out to the highest bidder. And with nowhere, I mean, they just put 8 million extra. Where do we get that from? Which is real far. I mean, so definitely we have, and that's one of the reasons why we're looking at to purchase from other boroughs as well, where we can afford, in terms of affordability, where we can afford. So that's one of the reasons where we're looking at doing things differently. Yes, we do have other boroughs purchasing property within the borough.
If I could very quickly just come in now, I just wanted to go back to the quality of life within temporary accommodation itself. So colleagues have touched on issues around visitors. Obviously, the site visits that we did were very informative. We really appreciated the opportunity to do those. And we saw, I think, some really good examples of hostel managers that were going above and beyond in terms of their job. They were dealing with a large number of people with quite complex needs. And we saw other hostel managers who maybe their approach to the role was more of a kind of building manager style. So it seems to me that both of those aspects ultimately need to be combined into the job. And we did have some kind of discussions on the day about that. And I just wondered about things like remuneration for the hostel managers, support for them in terms of how do we share information with them? How do we let them know about residents' complex needs in good time? But also, how are we attracting people into this challenging and demanding role who can provide everything we want? And is it something to consider that we should actually split that job and we should be having a practical on-site building manager as well as someone who's more akin to a social worker or a support worker that can help with benefits needs? Because from what I saw, there were people in that role who had a vast knowledge of support work. They'd worked with vulnerable people before, but that wasn't necessarily a requirement. That was just good fortune that they were in that job. Do you see where I'm going with that? So sorry, that's a bit long-winded, but your comments on the hostel managers role, much appreciated. And yeah, it would be nice to bring you in now, Beverly. Thank you for being such a patient guest.
I feel this is where I jump in. Yeah, there are some fantastic hostel managers across the TA suite of services. They absolutely do go above and beyond. And I know that my colleagues in housing needs, they have acknowledged that. They're building capacity so that staff can deliver services in a psychologically and trauma-informed way, which is fantastic. But the truth is that they shouldn't have to. We are seeing increasingly our TA services are turning into a de facto supported housing service because as demand has increased, so that group of people who have got high level complex needs, the demand has increased for being able to deliver them a housing option, as has our capacity within our supported housing provision has decreased. You know, capacity has gone down. And the truth is, wouldn't it be great if we could actually give them specialist supported housing solutions as opposed to putting them in TA? So yeah, it would be great if we remunerate staff, but it would be even better if we increased capacity across our supported housing provision.
Yeah, and I think what you've described there is very much the area which we were looking at earlier when I talked about looking at sort of the complex needs team. In terms of making sure we're linking in with the hostel managers. So Claire, who runs the service, and Heather, who's the manager for the area, obviously in daily contact with the hostel managers. They're also sometimes will be in the office and we will see them there, or we will go to them as well. But one of the things that we've now got in place is that regular, every couple of months meeting, which Jennifer and I will get together with them as well. Yesterday, we had 90 minutes together looking at the actions which we'd identified together with them at the previous meeting we'd had and making sure we're following through. In some regards, I was heartened because they were saying they had seen progress on the things that we were talking about, which I think would be things that would also chime with the things that you're sort of wanting to have assurance on. There were other areas where they were saying they really want us to be doing more, and Jennifer and I are really committed to making sure we've got that time with them. But absolutely, as Beverly says, looking at how we've got that end-to-end support in place, we are looking at how we could sort of redesign the roles to respond to the changing needs. And to come back to your question finally, in terms of the hiring, it's enormously challenging. It's really difficult, especially because people know how very, very difficult the role is, and it's not a well-paid role.
Questions? Councillor Garbutt, please go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to follow up on the question I asked earlier, just about residents' voice. And you said that they're not a settled community, but I just wanted to question whether there's any formal mechanism for them to feed back, or is it just informal stuff to the hostel manager, or does the hostel manager hold, you know, like regular meetings and the people who are there come to those? Do you know what I mean? Rather than it being a group of people that are self-organised, if it's not a settled community, it would just be good if they're able, it'd just be reassuring if they've got a mechanism to feedback of what things that they're experiencing.
So their relationship is with the both the hostel manager at the hostel, but also their housing advisor in terms of their personal housing plan. So they have regular contact through that. In terms of whether the hostels run resident meetings, I don't know the answer to that, but I can come back and respond in writing. Apologies, I'm just mindful of the time when the meeting finishes. Oh, I think yeah, some of them might, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Ones would have like a residence.
I think the point Councillor Garbutt makes is quite an important one, just because, I mean, in the shelter report, they did identify, you know, isolation has been such a huge problem for people. And I suppose we've got social housing residents, and all residents in this borough have access to tenants associations. So if we could encourage kind of action groups, that was one of the recommendations, temporary accommodation action groups. And I believe there is something in Hackney, but I'm not sure if it's something that actually is for, if you're getting many residents of temporary accommodation turning up to. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about that one.
Well, I was just going to interject to say I believe that there is work, for example, that Shelter do together. I think Councillor Potter has been involved with that. So I think there's a number of areas where people self-organise, and then you know, that's an additional channel of communication.
Can I quickly come in? Yes. Okay, sorry. I mean, I'll just leave it like that, well, with regards to shelter and everything. But like I said, they are all members of the Homelessness Partnership Board, and we all meet up and we do have conversations. We do discuss issues, and definitely there's always a two-way communication amongst us, and we meet regularly. The next meeting is next week, and so the means in terms of communication, in terms of wider group, in terms of our residents engaging in various activities, engaging in various charities of all sorts, is there. And also in terms of complaint as well, they have a right to make official complaints as well. I mean, because that has been encouraged as well. They have a right to make official complaints, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask? Otherwise, I wanted to sneak another one in, but I can see you really want to go. Okay. Just one more.
I know we need to let Rob Miller go.
Yeah, of course you can go if you need to. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We do really appreciate it, both of you. Okay. I think the meeting's probably come to an end. If I've got anything else, I'm going to put it in writing. Thank you so much to all of our guests. We do really appreciate your hard work. We know you're operating in very difficult circumstances. Good evening. So I'll now officially bring that item to a close. Thank you, everybody. Right. That brings us on to the minutes of the last meeting. The draft minutes for the meeting held on the 16th of February are included within the agenda pack for members to note and agree. Do members agree with the minutes of the meeting on the 16th of February? Lovely. Okay, item number 7, the Living in Hackney Work Programme for 2022 to 2023. The Living in Hackney Work Programme for the municipal year is included within the agenda pack. Please note that the following item has been rescheduled since the last meeting. That's the special joint follow-up meeting on the outcomes of Child Q Safeguarding Practice Review will now be held on the 25th of April. Commission members are asked to note the work programme for the 2022-23 municipal year. Yes.
Can I ask a
Councillor Young?
question about the temporary accommodation item before we agree that? Do we have a timetable for the sort of rest of this inquiry on temporary accommodation and the possibility of having a written report coming out of that inquiry?
I can come in. So the chair and I didn't actually put forward a timetable for it, but I think it's quite evident from this session that more work needs to be done on it. And I'm quite happy to work with the chair and vice chair on that.
Councillor Pell.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of our next session with the police, are we thinking of the KC report being featuring in that? It's, I don't know what our approach is going to be to that kind of from a scrutiny perspective in Hackney.
I'm sure that will form quite a large part. That's something to be discussed with the chair as well when she returns. Did you want to come in, Craig? Or one?
Yeah, I won't come in too much, but just to say we will, of course, be revising the work programme for the new municipal year. So you're more than welcome to put forward suggestions such as that during that process.
Okay.
To formally note, did you say that the accountability piece was going to be in April? So the cabinet question time that we're meant to have today, did you say that's going to be included in April?
I think we're hoping to reschedule that for April. It's not confirmed yet, but provided Councillor Moema can make that date, we definitely want to have it rescheduled because they're really important subjects. I'm sure we will put a bit of work into thinking of questions, so I do apologise that didn't go ahead. Right. Is there any other business from anybody? Okay.
Can I just say one
Yeah.
thing just about this temporary accommodation item? I could send an email, but it would be really useful if we could get numbers on disrepair cases in borough, out of borough, something you picked up on a previous commission about illegal disrepair as well. I think would be really interesting to know and be able to have that kind of those figures. Yeah.
Are we able to say it was a real shame that we weren't able to hear from the head of service in a way that doesn't suggest that? Yeah, I'm sure there's a very good reason why she couldn't be here, but
Yeah, we will certainly be saying that. There are several guests that were missing tonight, and it was a shame we didn't hear their on the ground expertise. I agree. We had a more kind of senior approach this evening, so we certainly will raise that. Thank you, Councillor Young. Is there anything else from anybody? Maybe. Okay. If there is no other business, I formally declare the meeting closed. Thank you all for your patience and your questions. Much appreciated.